Hello, everybody. This is the beginning of a new series based on another book of mine, which I wrote a few years ago. This is the book entitled Womanist Wisdom in the Song of Songs, Secrets of an African Princess. I want to tell you a little bit about why I wrote this book, and then we'll get, of course, into the introduction to the book. This particular lecture will focus on the introduction. So I initially wrote this book in the context of a class that I was teaching on love and sex. And as I was teaching, and of course, I would ask students to write some essays describing some of the relationship crises they had and, trying to address these crises based on the readings we were doing in the class. So I was asking them to kind of do therapy on themselves. As I began to read these essays and I've been teaching this class for over 20 years now, so I started to get a picture of how horrific the dating scene was today for millennials, Gen Zs, and of course, it's no better for me, uh, even at my age. So I began to long for a healing balm, to long for a guide, to long for wisdom, so that I could transmit this wisdom to my students, to help them navigate this world, this increasingly difficult world, this increasingly difficult dating scene. So this book was originally written for them in order to give them the wisdom to help them navigate these often difficult situations. So I kind of see the book as a kind of an advanced course in sex education. We have, of course, the very benign elementary course in sex ed in around the period of eighth grade. And then we have nothing, nothing. And so we're left to kind of, figure it out. So, and this particular course is extremely limited. I don't know if you remember your sex ed course. I remember mine vividly. Basically, I could summarize it like this. Don't have sex. And if you have sex, all of these diseases will happen to you, including pregnancy. There, that's that's the approach. So it's really a fear-based approach, right? If you if you have sex or if you have unprotected sex, beware, all of this will happen. You have to protect yourself or you have to abstain. So the approach is really based on fear and on self-protection, which is exactly the opposite of love. So the course, in a way, while it is teaching us how to have protected sex, is at the same time leading us away from what it means to love, which is to be vulnerable, to be unprotected, um, and to be fearless. You can't love if you have fear. So this approach, this elementary sex ed with all of the benefits, of course, it's good to be informed and to learn how to, I don't know, protect yourself. But this course is lacking in the sense that it doesn't teach how to love a romantic partner, how to sustain a relationship, how to attract commitment, how to craft commitment, how to navigate difficulties, how to navigate betrayal, infidelity. We don't have any course on this. We don't have an advanced sex ed class. We don't have a sex ed class, 200 level, 300 level. So this is really what the book was meant to do, was to fill that void, fill that gap, and offer such an advanced sex ed course. So before we go into, of course, so that's the goal, right? So the goal is really to offer this wisdom from this very ancient biblical book. And you might be surprised why I have chosen a biblical book, and I'll get into that in a bit. But I want to first talk about who is going to be our teacher in this class. Not going to be me. I'm just a channel. I'm just a vessel. Our teacher, the man who wrote the Song of Songs, right, is actually a very interesting person. And I want to talk about him a little bit so you can quickly get a grasp as to what his approach is going to be. What is his school of thought? How is he going to address this? And we're going to see that he's going to address this topic in a way that is very different from the traditional biblical view. which is, of course, traditional biblical view is a view which is focused on purity, uh, there are certain guidelines, there are rules of engagement, there are things you can do, things you cannot do. You can mess this up, right? So we have here a very, very different school of thought. And so I want to stop a little bit on this man, who he is, how he teaches, what is the difference between his approach uh, to love and to sex compared to the rest of the Bible before we can really understand where we're headed here. So let me introduce you a little bit to our sage, to our teacher, the man who is going to lead us here into this new realm of wisdom. So King Solomon was the third king of Israel. He was very different from both his predecessors and the men who came after him. He was a very great king who had he was also a very talented lover. He had hundreds of concubines, hundreds of queens. He had a lavish lifestyle. He was one of the richest kings in the history of the Kingdom of Israel. He also he was criticized at one point for going too far in his lavish lifestyle. He was criticized for being an idolater at one point, something which I disagree with based on his works, but that's another story. So he had, this kind of very lavish lifestyle, lots of wives, lots of women, a lot of experience, lots of riches and wealth. But at the same time, he is known for his very great wisdom. Um, in fact, he was so wise that people came from all over the surrounding nations to learn from him. And we even have a very peculiar story about a queen who was situated in what is today Eastern Africa, perhaps Ethiopia. And she was herself a great wise woman, a great queen. And she heard about Solomon and decided, well, let me check this guy out. This is intriguing. Who is this other wise man in the ancient Near East? And the story goes, and it's a true story. She traveled with a huge caravan of treasures. Of course, you never came to a king empty-handed. So she came and she met with King Solomon, learned from him, asked him her questions. There is it is very possible that they went beyond just conversations, that they actually had a love affair. And then she went back to her country, and here now we're in the realm of tradition or perhaps history. She then gave birth to a son who was born out of this beautiful love affair with King Solomon. And she's said to be the ancestress of the present day Jewish Ethiopians, the Falashas. So we have, right, this is really a king who knew his way around women, who was very wise. At the same time, this was a king who was the first king to have established peace with the surrounding nations. All of the other kings of Israel were fighting. They were fighting, they were in battles with the surrounding nations, exterminating them. King Solomon had peace. In fact, his name in Hebrew, Solomon in Hebrew, Shlomo, comes from the word shalom, which we all know, which means peace. So he had peace with his neighbors, and this meant that he traded with them openly. But not only that, he also traveled in their lands. We have evidence that King Solomon spent extensive time in Egypt. He traveled in their lands, studied in their schools, married their women. So this is a very unusual king who was capable of thinking outside of the box. This was a king who was not afraid to go beyond the borders of Jerusalem, to step into the unknown worlds that surrounded him, to learn at schools where the teaching was radically different from what he would learn in Jerusalem. He was somebody who was open-minded, who was a kind of pioneer, who was interested in new thoughts, new ideas, and of course, brought this into his writing. The way that he writes is systematically different from a lot of the more narrow religious Hebrew thinking that we can see in the biblical text. King Solomon breaks open. He kind of explodes some of these very rigid or narrow categories that you can encounter in biblical law, in the biblical patriarchal culture. Right? Notice that I said patriarchal culture, right? I don't think that God is patriarchal, but the culture of the Bible is definitely patriarchal. And King Solomon is going to explode this structure of patriarchy in many of his works. So his writing is going to be very different from, for example, the Pentateuch, the five books of Moses, or from the prophets, because you have this king who has traveled, who has opened his mind, who is capable of thinking outside of the box. So he's going to his main writings. There are three books that he wrote, including the Song of Songs, which is of course what we're going to study. But he also wrote the book of Proverbs, the book of Ecclesiastes, and then of course the Song of Songs. And these three books are actually classified in a particular school of thought in the biblical text called the wisdom literature school of thought. And these are the wisdom books of the Bible, which are going to be very much similar to how Solomon is writing. I'll give you a few other books that are part of this school of thought within the Bible. You have, for example, the book of Ruth, the book of Esther, the book of Job, the book of Daniel, the book of Lamentations, the Psalms. All of these books are united here in this school of thought called the wisdom books, or in Hebrew, the Ketuvim. So these wisdom books are going to be very different than the rest of the Bible in three main ways. The first way that they're different is that rather than being focused on God, on worship, what are the commandments of God, they're going to be focused on humanity, humanity's concerns, humanity's preoccupations. What does it mean to love well? How does one face death gracefully? How does one suffer with elegance? How does one find happiness? These are the themes that permeate the wisdom books. At the same time, these books are going to be much more open onto the other nations. There's going to be interactions, dialogues, influences of other worldviews, other ways of thinking that belong to the surrounding nations, especially in the works of Solomon, because he's well traveled. He has contacts with ancient Mesopotamia, with Egypt, with Canaan, and he brings in some of these influences into his work. And then third, of course, these books are going to be often very subversive. They will question traditional norms, traditional views of God. They will question patriarchy. You also have some very strong female voices in these books. So you can see here that we're entering a different school of thought. And we should expect that the treatise on love that King Solomon is writing, the Song of Songs, which we will learn from in this particular course, this treatise is going to also be part of this wisdom literature. And so it will also be human focused. It will also be open to the nations and especially subversive. We're going to see that this is not a treatise or a teaching which is going to be geared towards, good Jews or the good Christian girl or Christian boy or the trad bros, right? Or ortho bros, whatever is out there right now, right? This is not a book for this segment of the population. There's already enough teachings in the Bible on traditional norms of courtship, purity, and so forth that they can draw on. But this is a different target audience. Song of Songs has a different target audience than the traditional teachings of the Bible on love and sex. The target audience is actually those who, just like King Solomon, have a spirit of exploration, of curiosity. They want to know. They don't want to be limited. These are the people who want to explore, who are not afraid of breaking some rules, who want to understand why the rules exist. And so they have to experiment on their own. They have to take the step. They have to make mistakes. They have to try something. So this is the teaching. I call these books, these wisdom books, the gospel for the lost sheep, or the gospel of the black sheep. These are the people who just can't follow rules. The people who need to experiment on their own, to explore on their own, to make their own mistakes, just like King Solomon. So we are in good company here with King Solomon. If you are one of these people who cannot follow rules and has to explore and experiment on your own, you are in good company here with this particular teacher. So it's really a book which is going to be, in that sense, very modern, because it corresponds to the modern psyche of I want to experiment, I want to explore, I want to make my own, conclusion. I don't want to follow some authority or some authoritarian text. I want to make my own. This is very, very modern. This is something that this is the spirit of our times, isn't it? So this book is really for those who are really living in the real world. This is not a book for those who are in their communities in a certain context with a certain structure. This is a book for those of us who live in the real world and are dating real people. This is a book for those of us who, like many of my students, are secretly dating someone out of their religion or out of their culture, ethnicity, or tradition. This is for those of us who've had their virginity taken, to quote one of my students. This is for those of us who have been shamed and judged for our choices. This is for those of us whose parents have cut them off because they disapprove of their love interest. This is for those of us who have rushed into love and ruined everything. And finally, this is for those of us who have experienced betrayal and infidelity. So this is a book for real men and women who are living in the real world. And it's time there was such a book coming from the biblical tradition, because the biblical tradition is infinitely wise, but it doesn't just speak to the virtuous. The Bible doesn't just speak to those who have kept themselves pure, who are following all the rules. The Bible also has books, wisdom for those of us who chose a different path. And this is the beauty of the biblical text, that it's not speaking to just one audience. The biblical text is rich enough, profound enough to address a variety of audiences, including those who simply cannot submit to authority. Okay. So, and it's interesting because the character in the book, so King Solomon is the author, but the character that he chooses, who is going to be his mouthpiece, who is going to be doing most of the teaching, is actually a woman. And she's herself a real woman in the real world. Um, she's also dating someone outside of her tradition. The woman self-describes as dark-skinned or black, and it is very possible that she's coming from East Africa. It's very possible, in fact, even that she is the embodiment of this wise queen from Ethiopia who came to visit Solomon. It's even possible that she's the one who inspired the book or even wrote it. And then, of course, King Solomon collected this and made it into a book. Very often, by the way, love poems were composed by women in the ancient Near East, and they were supposed to be transmissions of wisdom when it comes to relationships and love. So it's very possible that the Queen of Sheba might have composed, or a woman in the court of Solomon might have composed such a love poem, and then Solomon maybe kind of, adapted it and added or took things out and then authored this book. So, but definitely we have a woman here who is teaching, and this is a woman. This is why sometimes I think there might have been a female authorship, because it's a woman who really knows, understands deeply female psychology. And so we have this woman here who is also part of the real world. She's, like I said, dating someone outside of her tradition. She's a black woman living in Jerusalem, dating a Jew, and this is frowned on, right? Racism existed all the way back into the Bible, right? So she also had her virginity taken. She talks about, we're going to talk about this in the first chapter, neglecting her vineyard, which is code name for the female body. She also was judged and shamed for her choices. At one point, she longs to bring her beloved into her mother's house where they would be safe from all of the gaze, the gaze of the judging gaze of the people who judge them as a couple. She longs to take him home in a safe space. She's also somebody who rushed into love and ruined everything. We're going to look at that. And finally, she's somebody who experienced infidelity and betrayal. So she basically makes every mistake in the book, and so does her beloved. And she's herself deeply flawed. We're going to look at, her personality, the issues of her personality, and we're going to see that her beloved is also a very, very problematic man. So it's interesting that she's not only she makes every mistake in the book and she's flawed and her man is flawed, but what is very powerful in this story, what I find extremely um, uh, hopeful, is that in spite of all of this, she eventually finds love. And a love which is defined in the book as strong as death. This is a love which is, as in other words, it can overcome death. So we are dealing here with a very flawed character who normally shouldn't deserve love at all. I mean, she transgresses, we're going to look at this. She transgresses all the rules of her engagement. She doesn't keep herself pure, neither does her beloved. I mean, if I was the biblical writer, I would make sure they get what they deserved, right? Some, ruined story because they made all these transgressions. See what happens when you don't follow the guidelines. No, the author, King Solomon, is actually celebrating this love. He's embellishing it. He finds it to be beautiful. And in the end, he gives them something that they do not deserve at all, which is a love that is true and a love that is as strong as death. And so, what I find beautiful about this book is that they, in fact, receive something that they don't deserve. They should not be receiving and in spite of all of this, they end up with a beautiful, beautiful love story. And so what I'm seeing here is that what we're going to explore is that ultimately, of course, we're going to learn, gain wisdom, and try to see how we can be better lovers and navigate, relationships and difficulties. But the most important thing we're going to learn throughout these different lectures is that love ultimately is a grace. It is not something you can work for. It is not something you have to strive for. It's not something that you have to, merit through all kinds of, things that you would do to attract it. Love is ultimately a gift. It's a grace. It comes to those who don't deserve it and to those who deserve it. It comes to both. And so the question is, of course, if love is a gift, if love is something that we can only receive, we cannot strive for it, how might we learn to position ourselves in order to receive such a love? How can we also, us, like this woman called in the book the Shulamite, right? How can we also, like the Shulamite, receive this love? How can we position ourselves to receive such a beautiful love, which is as strong as death? And so the Shulamite is going to teach us, right? She's going to give us wisdom, insights, but also she's going to help us position ourselves in this way. We're going to see what that means. So her teachings, there's going to be several chapters. First, we have to, of course, revisit what does it mean, purity? What is the true biblical definition of purity? When dealing with issues such as virginity and losing one's virginity and the shame that comes with that, we have to go back to this topic and examine what is the true biblical definition of purity. And can we get it back? That's the question. Second question is the art of seduction. How do we attract a relationship? It's not enough to now have, healed and so forth. We have to learn also how do we position ourselves to attract a relationship? How can we become seductive? So we're going to look at that. Then we're going to look at how to create healthy boundaries. It's important from the start to be able to create spaces between the lovers, to create firm boundaries. Then we will look at how to navigate betrayal and infidelity. It's very difficult, very important when you start a relationship, first to start it, but then how do we navigate difficulty, crisis, betrayal? It doesn't have to be infidelity, but at one point there will be betrayal. How do we face those with grace? And finally, no, not yet. Then it's an important chapter on lovemaking. This is where we get into really the art of sex that King Solomon is going to teach us. How do you make love in a way that is respectful, in a way that honors the dignity of the person you're with? We're going to focus, of course, how a man makes love to a woman in this context, right? That's really what most of these treatises were about. These ancient treatises on love were mostly, we're going to talk about that, written for men, that they might learn how to approach a female body. And finally, we will learn how to position ourselves to grace, to receive the grace of love into our lives. I will end beyond the teachings of Solomon on a mystical reading of the book. This book has often been interpreted as a metaphor for the love between God and humanity. So what can this particular book teach us about how God loves us? So that's the journey, that's the plan. And I look forward very much to see you in the next chapter entitled Virginity Reimagined. Thank you.